Welcome to Endurance Dad, the podcast for anyone striving to break their limits. I'm Dr. Domingo Molina, a dad, husband, and endurance athlete who went from struggling to jog a mile to crossing the Ironman finish line. Here, we dive into training, mindset, nutrition, and the relentless pursuit of growth. Because the toughest step isn't the last one, it's the first. Whether you're gearing up for your first race or pushing toward an ultra, you're in the right place. Let's get after it.
All right, well, thanks for joining the show. I'm equally as excited because it's not every day that we get a board-certified orthopedic surgeon and dual board-certified physical therapist to sit down and talk. So, Gait analysis is going to be really interesting when we sit down and talk about it.
Yeah. I'm excited to be on here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a concierge physical therapist, right? I think that's the most interesting thing that I really wanted to get to know more about.
Yeah. So I am a physical therapist for professional athletes, mainly NFL, and then do some NBA. And so during kind of the combine season and this off season, I have jumped in with a clinic to kind of help them out to be able to treat kind of the huge influx that happens during this time. And then during the season, which tends to be slower for us, then I have my own LLC that I'll go and I can do house calls and go to their place. And so I will often do that. And then I also teach Pilates. So I do private Pilates classes to be able to kind of incorporate that into PT. And it's become a really hot topic for even NFL players to be doing Pilates. So I encourage them to be involved in that.
I always tell my patients, I'm like, you need to go do Pilates because, I do spine surgery and, especially patients with scoliosis. Like, you got to go do Pilates. And it kind of gave me this look like, what are you talking about? And so, I've done hot yoga before. I didn't think that I would ever do hot yoga. And, I really enjoyed it. I've kind of gotten more into the core strengthening, hips, glutes. I do a lot of SI joint surgery. So I'm a real big believer in, strengthening, making sure that your pelvis is stabilized. And then so I try to push that off in these patients and, people just want a quick fix. They don't want to go to Pilates or go to yoga, and I don't have time for it. And
Right.
But so anyway, we'll get more into that in a little bit. But so you're in Dallas, right? You're not originally from Texas, right?
No, I originally from Iowa, and then I kind of moved around and worked in the college sector. I was in Ohio, and then I was in Alabama, and then I came to Dallas about 11 years ago. And kind of found my way in with a big healthcare system. And then through that kind of started to become more specialized in sports, specifically kind of that higher level athlete. And then we actually had a sports performance partner come in where I was working at my last job, and they see primarily NFL with it. Like I said, they do an NBA combine, so a pre-combine, pre-draft training. So we also got some of them as well. And so that kind of cemented my love for that high level athlete. And then kind of moved onto my own, like you said, kind of that concierge, because a lot of athletes will often travel with their PT or kind of want their PT to be able to do more of the house calls, those types of things. And so went into that. And then come this past January, then we had a class of 38 training for the combine. So helped out, provided medical services there. And then now we're in the busy season of off season. So that kind of is continued, kind of those guys that are coming off of the season have a lot of injuries, banged up. And that's kind of my role there.
Do you travel with them or?
So I don't for this group, but I've seen some of these guys for 3-4+ years. So every time Dallas, I always say I would love to go back to Iowa, but a lot of football players aren't going to want to do their off season in good old Iowa. So a lot of guys will come and go to Dallas for the summer just because it's an easy, relatively inexpensive place for them to live. Still a big city, still kind of a fun city for them. And then obviously a very high level healthcare system.
I'm not sure what you're comparing inexpensive. I mean, I trained in Frisco. And
That's true.
Frisco is
true.
It was not inexpensive to live in Frisco. But,
it is not.
Yeah. But they have great facilities. They have the huge Dallas Cowboys training facilities there. And I don't know, Frisco's very up and coming, so I think everybody kind of wants to be,
And
in
Texas loves their
Texas.
football, so there's a lot of resources that are put forth to have indoor fields, indoor turf fields, indoor practice fields. Most of the high schools have either an indoor turf or access to an indoor practice facility, which again in Iowa is not normal. And so just those opportunities to be able to use any type of facility if we ever need it is there for the guys. Doesn't matter if it's January where it's really cold or when we get to June, it's so hot here that really doing an outdoor turf is tough for them.
Yeah, well, cold in Texas is relative, right? From Iowa
Yes,
or
that's
Ohio.
very true.
Were you always in orthopedics, or how did you get into orthopedics?
So I so when I went to PT school, so I always knew I wanted to be a PT. When we were in 6th grade, we wrote a letter to our senior self of what we thought we were going to do. And so when we crossed the stage at our senior graduation, we got these letters of what we thought we were going to do from 6th grade. And actually in 6th grade, I said I was going to be a sports physical therapist. I was going to go to the University of Iowa. And I had this whole planned out at 6th grade. I'd never seen a physical therapist, never been to a physical therapist. So I have no idea how I knew at 6th grade what a physical therapist was. But I kind of always knew that I wanted to be PT. And then I went into undergrad and kind of was like, okay, I'm going to get a job. I'm going to pay my way through college. And so one of the things I did is I worked in the burn unit to help physical therapists there. So it was a trauma 1 center. So I did trauma and burns. And I thought for sure that's what I wanted to do. I fell in love with it and then got to the very end of my clinicals. And my last clinical was in sports and orthopedics. And I was like, okay, I love this. And it provided a lot of opportunity because when I did move to Ohio, I was at Miami of Ohio, which is a very small town. It's actually the only public university in the United States that doesn't have an interstate leading to it. So I didn't even have an option to work at a trauma 1 center. So that really cemented, okay, I'm going to go more the orthopedics and more the sports route. And the thing I love about the burns and trauma was truly being able to kind of treat the whole self. So not just the physical part, but there's obviously a lot of components that go into burns. They're never going to look the same. There's a lot of pain associated with the healing process. There's a lot of a mental component, and realize that that could be applicable to working in sports and ortho. It just looks a little bit different, but everybody's kind of dealing with some type of either identity or challenge. When we see the NFL guys, there's a chance that they don't go back. They can't provide to their families. All these people rely on them. And so now they have pressures that are different than maybe what a burn unit patient may look like, but they're still dealing with some type of kind of mental hurdle. And so I found that I really love that part of physical therapy. I know we were talking about, the amount of time you get to spend with patients. And I'm lucky enough that I get to spend 1 to 2 hours, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week with a patient. So I get to know all of these types of things. And then we get to work on addressing, again, not just the physical component, but what did it look like trusting your leg again at a high level? And what does it look like when you're going through all these pressures of people asking when you're going to be back, or a coach or an agent, somebody that has maybe different goals or motives, or maybe it's a contract year and that looks different from person to person. Maybe an organization doesn't necessarily want to sign this big contract with you at the end of the contract year. So they'll push out kind of your rehab, slow it down. And so just kind of that whole mental side is what I loved about PT.
So do you fight with some of these, I wouldn't say companies, but these contractors that you're like, no, I want to get this patient back quicker, and they're like, no, you need to slow down a little bit? I mean, what's the pressure there to get these people back on the field?
Yeah, so that's kind of the challenge. You get both sides, right? You get the side of why can't they be back right now? Why can't they? We get this all the time with ACLs, right? So you had Adrian Peterson that came back at 6 months. But what we know is the research that's been done is that 9 months is really the sweet spot. And anytime that you come back, every month you come back before 9 months, your chance of re-rupturing goes up by 50%. So coming back at that is just such a high risk, but they have this idea that they can do it in 6 months. They have this idea that, and so sometimes even coaches or position coaches will be like, or agents will say, well, why can't they be back in 6 months? Like why can't you make it so that they can be back in 6 months? Because really this is their timeline, right? Versus, then you have the other side where you have a $12 million guy who is truly up for a bigger contract at the end of this year, but if he doesn't have tape, then they can say, oh, we just want another year. We want to sign you another small 1-year contract to see what it looks like. And so you really kind of rely back onto the research. You really rely back on, here's what the research points to us. Yes, an ACL for sure can be back by 9 months. There's no reason if he tests out and everything looks good that we need to hold him for 12 months. And then on the flip side, no, we need to wait 9 months. There's no reason for him to come back at 6 months because he's probably going to re-rupture that.
Yeah.
And
I think
so,
yeah, that's hard. I had a kid the other day that had a bone bruise on his tibia. I told him, look, if you go back to playing soccer, a risk for rupturing ACL, you're not going to be, where you need to be. You're injured. You pivot wrong. There goes the rest of the season. The parents, they bought it for 6 weeks.
right.
I said, you need to be out longer. And,
Right.
then they come back and they're like, well, why can't he go back? And so,
Yeah.
I think it's definitely hard to be sometimes the bad guy and sometimes you're the good guy when I'm see these patients. I'm like, no, you can go back. It's fine.
And they're
But
so excited.
yeah, for sure. So how did you, I know orthopedics, everybody wants to be in orthopedics. How did you separate yourself and end up in this role? Because, we're talking about spending time with patients and, I send somebody upstairs for physical therapy and, they get seen by the PTA, they get evaluated by a physical therapist. And, unfortunately in healthcare these days, with insurance, you can't spend, even as a physical therapist, an hour with each patient. You're there to do evals and the PTAs are there to do the rehab. And, sometimes I think it's detrimental to the patient because I get patients back and, they say, well, I saw the PTA, but then I saw a different one the next visit and, there's no continuity of care. How did you overcome that adversity of one, getting into orthopedics when everybody else probably wanted to do it, and then 2, saying, hey, I'm going to take this job because I really want to focus on patient care?
Yeah. So it's kind of twofold. So for the patient care side of it, it was something probably I fought with and fought for the longest time because, like you said, the healthcare model is truly looking at PT sees them for the initial eval, but then the PTA carries on the treatment, or the PT will see them this time, but then the next PT will see them the next time, and then it will be a different PT. And like you said, it's so hard to kind of have that continuum of care and be able to have a smooth kind of rehab process. It was something that, especially when it got to high level, I advocated for myself and truly said, hey, I'm going to see patients one-on-one, but you're going to see that my cancellation rate is very low. So my cancellation rate was 5% or less. But I said, I will show you the value. I will show you from, obviously, anybody, it's a business, right? You have to also bring in money. You can't just chit chat with patients, right? So I also showed, and from a financial standpoint, that I could do this model. And then from there, I truly showed the patient the value and what I was doing for them. And then they bought in. And so it kind of helped for both of us because then they were more bought in, which the outcomes were better. And then, like you said, so many people want to go into orthopedics. So you have to set yourself apart. Especially as you start to get higher and higher up, so many people want to go into treating that professional athlete. So what does that look like and how are you different? And so, like I said, I truly made sure that I was up on all the current research. I made sure I set myself apart by getting my board certification. So in the PT world, 1% has their SCS, so they're sports board certified specialist. And then I have my orthopedics as well. So I'm dual certified, and that's like 0.01% of PTs. So it was truly kind of to set myself apart so that people could trust me that we're referring outside, right? So, we have teams that are states away that then they're going to just pick a clinic in Dallas to send their guys to. And how do I show them that, hey, I took care of this guy. This is what it looks like. This was his outcomes. And this is why you need to send to me. And then the other important thing I think is truly networking and making relationships with doctors, right? And with surgeons, not only in this area, but the surgeon so Dr. Anderson, Bob Anderson, is a very common ankle surgeon for the NFL. So knowing and showing, him like, okay, I've seen these Achilles, this is their outcomes, continue as you send to Dallas, like I can be your person. And then initially on, and I'm probably not even the best now, but I truly was flexible for the athlete in the sense that I see a 6 a.m. right now because I have an athlete that wants to be
Mm-hmm.
seen at 6 a.m. And then I have other athletes that are like, I'm not getting out of bed till noon, and that's when I'll see you. And so I truly kind of worked with the athlete to make myself available. And I think that also makes a big deal as you start to get up into those higher level that are so used to, this is my schedule. And if you're very firm on saying, well, can't see you, then, it's going to be the next person that's going to do that.
And so you get a large percentage then that come from out of town, or?
Yeah, I would say 80%
Oh, wow.
are from out of town, maybe even closer to 90%.
Wow.
So a good chunk. A lot of them will come in and move either for their stint of rehab. So depending on, like, I have an Achilles right now from California, and so literally the family moved here to do the rehab here. So a lot of times there, or like I said, I have a lot of relationships with different teams. So a lot of teams will say, okay, here's your options. Where do you want to go live?
Do you work with PTAs or have partners, or are you doing all this by yourself?
I actually have, except for my very first job, I've never worked with a PTA.
Oh,
So
wow.
my very first job, I was there for maybe a year before I moved states, was the only time I've ever worked with PTAs. So my last company, which again is a big healthcare corporation, they were actually very adamant that we didn't hire PTAs. So that was one of their kind of contracts with, insurance providers. And what they told providers is, hey, when they come here, they're going to see a PTA. We actually didn't have aides or techs, and we didn't have PTAs. So it was kind of all on us to do it all, which I think was a great way for me to learn on, okay, it's me and it's only me, which can be good and bad, right? Because there's
All right.
nobody else to blame if something goes wrong, but it's also something you get to be able to control a lot of variables.
Yeah, I know. Well, so I'm the only spine surgeon in this area. And so, I guess probably the same for you. Sometimes it makes going on vacation hard, or,
Yes.
weekends, my phone. Yeah, that's why I run at 4:30 in the morning, because my phone's not ringing. I'm not getting texts. So
Yeah.
it's definitely hard when you're the only person. But
For sure. Because you'll get, especially with these guys, they're up way late, which I'm like you. I run at 3:30 in the morning. So for me, like, my phone going off at midnight is really not great for me. But that's kind of their world. They'll go to bed 12, 1, 2. And I'm
yeah,
normally like, all right, well, I'm probably getting up when you're going to bed.
yeah, for sure. So I know that you have some specialties. Gait analysis, right, is one of them. How
Yes.
is that like a passion of yours, or is that something you kind of believe that really affects everybody's recovery as a whole? Or tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So initially, when I came to Dallas, the company I worked for wasn't really into the pro sports world at that time. So I'd come from working with college athletes, and we didn't really have any professional sports or really many college athletes. Most of them were high school or just weekend warriors. And in Dallas, there's a huge running population. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to pivot because this is the population I'm seeing at the time. I worked very closely with an ankle, and still do, with an ankle and foot surgeon. So he often saw a lot of these athletes, weekend warriors, or I saw all of his Achilles rupture surgeries. And so obviously with that, it's relearning to walk. And then a lot of these people, again, like to go back to running, because here in Dallas, we can run a good chunk of our year outside. And so that's
All right.
a very popular mode of exercise. And where I live is right by a lake that has a 9-mile loop. So it's very popular for people that are training for half marathons or marathons to be in this area. And so we just saw a lot. And so again, it's one of those that, how do you set yourself apart? I'm like, okay, this is the population that's presenting to me right now. I need to go learn everything I could. And so I took a bunch of courses and really truly dove into learning how to analyze gait, using video software to analyze gait. And then eventually my boss and I started a sports residency program for our company. And so with that, one of the things that you have to be able to do while you're studying and being able to sit for your SCS is have a gait analysis portion. And so I was one that was in charge of teaching that. So we all know that the best way to really reinforce your learning is to teach that. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to teach somebody this, I got to really know it. And so I taught for the sports resident. I taught the ankle and foot, and then as well as gait analysis. And what did that look like for even returning back to running? And what does returning back to running look like? How do you progress that? Those types of things. So, and then obviously it comes in handy with a lot of the Achilles that I see from NFL.
I think it's undervalued in general. I tell people, one of my nurse practitioners, I convinced her to sign up for a 5K, and she was like, well, my foot hurts, it's in my arch. And I said, well, you probably need a gait analysis. A lot of these running stores are starting to do gait analysis now, because if you start running bad and keep running bad, then you're either going to quit because you get injured or you get injured. And
Right.
so, when I was training for my first Ironman, I'd put a video camera right by the treadmill and I would record my gait, and then I'd look on YouTube, I'd learn about gait analysis. And, because I think that people get discouraged, part of the podcast theme that I wanted to do was how to get motivated people to stay motivated and not get injured and then give up, because they say, well,
Right.
I can't run because I have flat feet or my feet hurt all the time. There's so many variables, shoes or gait. What would you say to somebody that had nothing? I mean, I didn't want to do an episode where it was like gait analysis and people are like, oh, I don't want to listen to that episode. How do you get the person off the couch to say, hey, you don't need to know a ton about gait analysis, but what's the easiest way to get somebody to start the way they need to start and continue with it without getting injured?
I think one of the easiest ones for pretty much anybody to do is look at their cadence, right? And measure their cadence, right? And so we know that cadence is, first of all, so the way I do gait analysis and what research supports is that outside of your cadence and outside of the verbal cue of turn on your core, there's actually no other variable that you can change while you're running. So a lot of times people are, will have their knee drop or their hip drop or any of those types of things, or the foot goes flat. And you can't say, okay, every step I want you to think, don't let your knee cave in, right? What we know is running is basically a snapshot of where your muscles are at that point in time. And so a lot of times,
so I
Go
can't
ahead.
say I'm going to hit with my forefoot every single step. It's going to happen the way
It's going to
I run.
happen based off of the muscles that you have, the strength that you have, and kind of what your body has learned. Okay, you want me to run this speed. You want me to run this far. This is what I have available. And so really what I tell people is we use the gait analysis, and then from there, we identify where are your weaknesses and then address those weaknesses off running. So in some type of strength training. And I always tell people, because I know runners are always like, oh, I don't want to spend time strengthening. I just want to run, right?
Yeah.
And so I tell them it doesn't take a long time. It's not like you're going to the gym for 2 hours and lifting or anything like that. But there's a few exercises that are pretty basic that they can throw into their routine to really kind of start to address that, because your body is going to use, again, whatever muscles, the path of least resistance. So whatever is strong, they're going to use. Whatever is weak is going to get weaker because you're not using it. But the two things that we know in research that you can influence is cadence and then telling yourself to turn on your core. So I always tell people, if you have nobody to look at your gait and you have no idea what it looks like when you measure your gait, you look at a video of your gait. If you can look at your cadence, so we know it's ideally like 170, 180, right? Depending on some people, maybe the 165. But if you can measure cadence, and some watches even measure it, right? But if you can have either you're really good at counting, just count your right foot for a minute, times it by 2, then you know that if you have a much lower cadence, then we know you're striding way far out, right?
See, there's
and
tons
the
of
chances,
wearables now that have cadence. In fact,
that
you
looks
said
like cadence.
You said 170. So
yeah.
let me look at my run this morning. I thought 120
so
was good, but
no, is really what we're So anything that's less than that, we know that you're having to stride out. Go ahead. Yeah, what did you do?
145. So I need some
Okay,
work
so we
then.
need to work on this. So a lot of times that what's happening is people will stride out, and then there's a lot of components on why somebody is striding out, right? Are they relying more on their passive structures like their ligaments, their joints, versus using their muscles? So when they land underneath you, it does require a little bit more eccentric muscle work, because now you have to support that. You can't rely as much on those passive structures, but then also it changes your striking pattern. So kind of like what you were saying, forefoot versus heel strike. When you strike out and you're doing 145 steps per minute, you have no other option but to contact with the heel. You have to,
Mm.
right? But if you contact more underneath your body, you're going to go more to the forefoot. And
So what's the
so,
perfect, or so where should you hit? Forefoot, midfoot?
so ideally in a perfect world, it would be midfoot to forefoot. And there's positive and negatives to both sides, right? If you go more forefoot, then you're going to require a lot more of the calf. And so it comes down to, you can't just go from 145 heel strike and then all of a sudden say, I'm going to go 170 and land on the balls of my feet, because all of a sudden those calves that are probably not used a whole lot are having to be used, because you think about that's 175 steps every minute. And how
Right.
many minutes are you running, right? And so it's also, there was research that was shown that they did a study at the Boston Marathon where they put basically a sensor in the runner's shoes, and they asked the runners, are you a forefoot, midfoot, or a heel striker? And a lot of them said either midfoot or forefoot. But what was found in actual research and actual looking at that is that 85 to 90% were actually heel strikers.
Well,
So
because I think a
people
lot of
may
people,
think,
people don't want to be heel strikers, right? Look at the
right.
Newton tennis shoes pride themselves on being forefoot runners, right? So
Correct.
there's like a whole
Correct.
movement. No, but that's interesting. I need to work
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
my.
So then what we tell people is, just like running, your goal is to not increase it much more than 10% every week. So you're not going to be able to go from 145 to 175, or your body's going to truly feel it, because again, it's all different activations of those muscles. It's a lot more of eccentric quad. It's a lot more of that calf, those types of things. And so it's, you have to gradually go into it, but it is something that people can change just by, whether it be, there's lots of playlists on Spotify that are set to a certain beat per minute. So if somebody likes to run to a certain type of music, there is, rap music to cadence of 170 to 180. And that can actually help with that. So
I think almost every watch. I think the Apple Watches do cadence now. The Garmin, I wear a Garmin. They do. I wore a foot pod for quite a while on the shoe, and I think that's probably a little bit more accurate. But so what kind of injuries are you seeing then from people that are not or under the cadence?
Yeah, so that's where we see a lot of knee pain, a lot of kind of that runner's knee that you hear, and then a lot of kind of foot pain, right? Because you're going to land with your heel, and then you're going to almost kind of have to crash down to pull through, because you're not really at an ideal position. But I would say the biggest thing is, and so this is a really not great thing for those that are post-op ACL, right? Which is why you have to be very intentional with how you progress somebody back to running after an ACL, because then they're relying all on the passive structures, which the passive structure is the ACL, which is the last thing you want to stress. So a lot of it is eccentric quad. So just that ability for it to absorb that. And then some hip we'll see, but it's definitely more knee, because again, you have to land more stiff. You have to land on your heel, and you think about kind of those forces going up that leg. Most often, that's what we're going to get, is just that runner that says, my knee doesn't feel good. You'll get some IT band complaints, especially if they try to make that change of their cadence too quick, of landing right underneath them, and then their quad's not strong enough. They're going to reach to that IT band to truly get that stability. So if they're trying to change it and they don't have the strength, then that's where we kind of see that, the outside of the knee really is bothering them. The IT band is really, really tight for them, which then again gets worse and worse as times go on.
You're talking post-ACL running like sports, or, can marathoners get back to doing marathons after ACL?
For sure. There's truly, I tell people, for an ACL, there's truly not anything that you can't get back to. So if you tore your ACL and then want to run a marathon after that, right? It's just about being intentional with how, and it's actually probably easier, right? Because a marathon runner, in the sense that you get to control a lot of things, right? You know which direction you're going. You're running mostly in a straight line. It's more with the ACL, it's that plant and cut that become the really challenging, and it's the reaction part of it. And so obviously you're not having somebody come tackle you as a marathon runner.
So what about the rates of arthritis? You probably know this a little bit more than I do, because I do more spine, but we do know that people that tear their ACL, even get it repaired, are a little bit more predisposed to knee arthritis. Do you see people that get more knee arthritis, post ACL that are marathoners? Or
I don't see a lot of it. I'm not seeing them. I'm seeing them more of like in the 30s or 40s, right? So is it presenting later on? I think the biggest thing is that, are they strengthening correctly to go back to their sport? So again, same thing, even though they aren't being tackled, it's still important that they get all that strength back, because 26 miles is really long. And so being able to do that repetitive motion in a controlled, even with somebody that's not injured, is challenging. So how do we ensure that that person, because again, arthritis is basically those forces aren't going through that knee truly correctly. And so how do we, again, which I think is one of the bigger challenges, is how do we get them to strengthen and maintain that strength even during their training, even as they're training for a marathon.
What are the best exercises for doing?
So definitely anything that is, and I like to be really functional with it. So anything that is like a single leg squat is really great, because that is truly what running is, right? It's just like continuous having to land and absorb in a single leg squat. So being able to do single leg squat, and then I love a single leg RDL because that's doing posterior chain. I always give a heel raise because obviously we're doing heel raises throughout that. But I think the really important thing with heel raises is that when you're going up onto the balls of your feet, is that you're going towards that first toe, right? That we're not rolling to the outside. And so a lot of times people will just do heel raises and they just go through them really quickly, but not intentionally. And so really when you're running, we know our strongest calf muscle is our inside calf muscle. So in order to truly activate that correctly, you have to go to the first toe. As soon as you roll out, you're kind of changing the forces and what can be activated. And then the two that are non-negotiable are a plank and a side plank, because both are so important, right? And we know that the plank is one of the greatest activation of full body, right? So if you're truly doing a plank correctly, the shoulders are activated. Not only is the core activated, but then you have your glutes activated, your quads activated. I tell them to drive the balls of their feet into the ground. So, and you have anterior tib, you have, for the side planks, you're going to have all of your inverters and everters kind of kicking on depending on which version or, which variation you do of side plank. But those are so important because same idea, when you're running, you need to have, we always say you can't have two mobility segments side by side, right? So you can't have the legs move and the core not be stable and move. So we need to be stable in that core to be able to move our legs efficiently and to be able to move our arms efficiently. And that's probably the gait deficit that we see the most, is a weakness in either the core or our glutes. But when we say our glutes, it's part of our core, the side glutes, right? And so we'll either see a foot drop or a hip drop, or a lot of times you'll see a big crossover of the trunk or the upper body trying to kind of compensate for those weak obliques or weak core. So
that's what I started doing in clinic.
Things.
I've started getting people up and I'm like, look, can you do a single leg squat? And I learned that from, I had this crazy idea to get certified as a personal trainer. And I kind of flew through a lot of the material, and then I stopped at the assessment, and one of their assessments was, the single leg squat. And I thought, oh my gosh, all these people with SI joint pain that I've been treating, how many of them have I done surgery on that just potentially have had, weak glutes, weak cores,
Yeah.
So I'm very diligent now, and you need to work on single leg squats, like you said, RDLs. People, again, will sit there and look at me and be like, why are you doing this?
My back hurts. Why are we doing a single leg squat, right?
Because I've had SI joint pain, when there was a period of time where I wasn't working out and I started to get real bad SI joint pain, and even just running in itself, strengthens the glutes, and a lot of that went away. So I think that's the weakness of orthopedic surgeons, is we just rely on physical therapists, and we're like, okay, we're done doing surgery. We'll send you upstairs. And, so now I try to sit down with the patients and I'm like, look, you need to work on strengthening, like we said, Pilates, yoga, and hopefully I think some listen, some may not.
But you've done your part,
I've done my part.
And that's the important part.
And I try to bring home the personal experience, try to empathize with them, and say, hey, look, I've had this pain. I've been in the same place you are, and I think that maybe hits home a little bit more for them.
For sure. For sure. And then also it puts a little bit in their hands and empowers them, I think, as well, when they start to see the improvement with just truly strengthening, right? Because if you strengthen, even for a runner, right, a stronger runner is going to be a faster runner, and same thing in the sport, like in the NFL, you would be surprised how many can't do a single leg squat. I just eval'd somebody the other day that was almost cleared by the team. And so they were just like, hey, they're going to come for the last little section of their rehab. And so one of my very first tests I do is a step down test. So for 60 seconds, they have to step down from a box. It's just a 6-inch box. So it's not anything super tall or anything like that. And literally could not do it. Could not do one. And I was like, okay, so this is somebody that's going to be, doing a high level sport. And so truly then it helps them be able to use that as almost, we'll test it every 4 weeks and they'll say, I'm getting stronger. Like, the first time they saw you, they couldn't do it, but maybe for that follow-up visit, now they can do it. And I think that also empowers them and kind of puts them in control of what they're doing with their body.
Well, where we see that a lot of is in high school kids. I see a ton of kids that come in, they're playing basketball, football, soccer, volleyball, they're doing all year round sports, and nobody's giving them the fundamentals of either core strength or just strengthening in general. I call it the locker room mentality, where, and most of them get hurt in the locker room, right? They herniate a disc and, they're trying to out squat their friend, out bench press their friend. And I try to tell them, I'm like, look, even the trainers, I try to get some of the athletic trainers I'd rather send them to physical therapists first, because I feel like some of the athletic trainers maybe just try to get them back in or just show them some exercises, to agree with what you're saying. I think a lot of them they don't have those core fundamentals, and, plus they're training all year round and they get hurt. And it's not until they go to the college level where I think it's a little bit more instilled in them and they have a little bit more routine and they start working on some of those stuff. But by then some of them are hurt. So it's hard to.
But he's going to say they don't get to that point, or they continue these bad habits because that's the only way. I was talking to somebody that he learned to squat very poorly in high school. He's in the NFL now, but he said through all of college, until they got a good strength coach, for 3 years, he was like, I was squatting 600 pounds, but he goes, I was doing it with horrible form, in the sense that then he had to go have surgery on his knee. And he's like, but nobody really truly taught me the fundamentals of this is how you squat. So even now that he's, 3-4 years in the league, we're still kind of breaking down those fundamentals. This is how you perform a step up. This is how you do a deadlift. Those types of things, which I hope it's continually getting better at the college level, at the high school level, if they start truly having these kids lift weights, and you want them to learn the fundamentals correctly before it's what's your 1 rep max, which hopefully most people are going away from 1 rep max, but you'd be surprised at how many high schools do it.
Oh yeah, all the time.
And so it's like, what are you doing? And you probably see it from like a back situation. I'm like, you're 15 years old and you have back pain. Like,
well, I see a ton of 14, 15-year-olds now with, I had one to come in the other day and she had a 2-level disc herniations.
Yeah.
15 years old. So I see that more and more. Some of it, I think, these kids are bigger now. So I think
for sure
obesity is a little bit of an issue. Deconditioning, right? A lot of these kids, I guess they're weekend warriors all week long. And so they, they probably, need to be doing other things. But
for sure.
What's the best way as far as persistence, overcoming these, bad habits? Or I'm sure you see a lot of these patients just have self-doubt. And so how do you get them to overcome that mental aspect of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's the most fun part about my job, is kind of how do you motivate each person's slightly different, right? And I know you were talking about it is, how do you get it so that somebody doesn't go out too fast and do something, like, okay, now I want to train for a marathon. I'm just going to jump right into training. And really they've never ran before. They haven't done any type of strengthening, and then they just go right into a plan, right? Is truly telling them first, let's start with A, the fundamentals, but B, start small, right? Like your first run that you're training for a marathon doesn't have to go out and run 8 miles, because that's where we see the burnout happen. And that's where we see, they go out too fast, too strong, too hard. And then they're like, well, I don't like this, or it's painful, or this isn't enjoyable. So I think truly the first part is I take them, it doesn't matter who they are, how long they've been training. I kind of take them back to the basics because I always say there's a reason, for the most part, there's a reason why you got injured, especially our overuse injuries, right? Our overuse injuries we know are preventable injuries. They're overused because something is off. Something is not firing correctly. Something is not activating in the correct pattern. You're overusing some muscle and not using the correct muscle because we know you can run without pain. So how do we get these people that have overuse injuries? So it's truly kind of breaking down the movement and looking at simple movements like that we're going to start with before we start, for example, just a squat, before we go to a single leg squat, before we go to a jump, before we go to a run, checking to see, okay, is that form correct? And if it's not, do you even have the muscle strength to perform the exercise that you need to be able to do? And then as you go to single leg, okay, you can't do a single leg squat. Well, we know running is just repetitive over jumping, single leg squat, jumping, single leg. That's what running is. Well, if you can't do a single leg squat stable, how do we expect you to take the force of your entire body? You know, it's 3.5, I think, or times your body weight every time you hit the foot hits the ground when you're running. And so you think about up to 7 times. So you think about you can't squat your body weight, but now you're going to go run and do 3 times your body weight. Like that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so a lot of times it's truly educating them. And most of the time people know. Like people know if they're like, I really just wanted to skip all this part and run, but I know that I'm in pain. So I'm obviously not doing something right. But it's also then working with them to get back to whatever their sport is. Every rehab, not. And I feel like this is maybe something that people always say, well, I've been to a physical therapist, so I don't need to go to one. And I'm like, okay,
I
I
get that all the
promise
time.
you it will be different, right? I promise you it will be different. Because no session ever looks the same. B, your session at 8 o'clock looks nothing like the person at 9 o'clock. And
Well,
I
because you
always
do a
tell
lot
people
of you do other things, right? Massage, myofascial,
yeah,
therapy. I mean, there's other things I tell people. You don't always have to do exercise. Don't have it in your mind
correct.
that you're just going to go do exercise. And they're like,
Correct.
well, I did therapy 3 years ago. Okay, well, that's doesn't apply
Well,
here.
hopefully this is different, right? But yeah, it is that. And we know that there's a lot of like mind-body connection. So we even have like a cognition app that even while I'm working with them, like myofascial release or doing some soft tissue, they'll be doing some type of cognitive game on the iPad or whatnot, because we know there's also a cognition component to the firing of how well are you cognitively thinking about things, especially post-ACL. We know that delay is not there. I also use it because if you're sleep deprived or you're not hydrated or those types of things, cognition is slower. So I can always kind of tell by that day, okay, if you're slower than what your normal is, something is off, right? So this is probably not a day that I'm going to go have you sprint, cut, and jump, because we know your response time is not great. And we know with that response going down, then we know you're at more risk of an injury. So I also try to kind of incorporate that as well. But then, yeah, I tell them like a long distance runner, their rehab and the way that we do a single leg squat or the way that we do a side plank is going to look like a runner. So when you're doing a side plank, you're going to bring your leg up like you're running in a side plank. Or if you're doing a single leg squat, you're going to go up to single leg balance and use opposite arm, opposite leg, versus maybe a running back that it may look slightly different because now we're cutting. So maybe we're doing a single leg with a response, a single leg jump, squat, and land to response. Or maybe there's a ball involved or whatnot. So I truly try to make it very specific for the athlete as well. What's their love? What do they like to do? What do they want to get back to? And it would do no good for me to give a marathon runner some type of football, go run a football, they could care less, right? But same thing, if I gave a football player that's a wide receiver, instead of giving him a route, gave him something that would give, a marathon runner that we're working more endurance versus more power, they wouldn't enjoy that either. So I truly try to tap into the loves of the patient so that they don't feel like just because you're doing exercise, we know the reason why behind that exercise. You need to be able to do a single leg squat because this is what we saw in the assessment. And then giving that feedback. So, hey, we're going to analyze this in 4 weeks. We're going to reanalyze it. We're going to look at how the improvement, and I'll put side-by-side pictures. Look, this is where you landed before. You landed with only 10 degrees of knee flexion. Now you're landing with 20 degrees of knee flexion or knee bend when you land. That's exactly where we need to be.
Right.
Okay, now we just need to work on that endurance and be able to continually land that way. So I think that's a huge thing for PT, is making sure that not every single person gets a straight leg raise, or not every single person gets a bridge, but how do we make it specific for that patient?
Right. So you talk about the, learn one, do one, teach one, and teaching the persistence to the athletes and overcoming the self-doubt. How did you do that coming up as a therapist? I know one of your passions is, really kind of motivating women to excel in healthcare, to get in healthcare, or just really career fields in general. Talk about some of your kind of overcoming adversity coming up as a therapist.
Yeah. So I think this is probably one of the hardest parts of my career, because as we were talking about, I worked so hard to go and get my dual certifications and work so hard to truly learn. I got my certified strength and conditioning specialist, so I truly could learn the weight room and performance side of it, because I wanted to be able to provide to my patients the best of the best. But even with that, I have run into a lot of obstacles as a female in this world, especially a female in the NFL world. So I remember the very first patient I saw in Texas that was sports. It was a quarterback, and his dad came in with him, and his dad found out that he was seeing me, and he's like, my son is not seeing a girl. She doesn't know anything about football. And I remember and so self-doubt starts to creep in a little bit. Maybe I'm not as skilled as that male that did play football, right? But I was thankful I had a manager that said, you can either see her or you can go to a different clinic. And so he truly stood up for me. And once I eval'd this patient, and I was like, okay, we're going to go out in the field, and I'm going to have you throw these 2 types of passes. I'm going to go and run a route. And all of a sudden, his dad was like, oh, you know football. And I was like, yes, I know football. But I still, even to this day, I think as you go farther in your career, you become more confident in your skills and more confident in what you're delivering. And you start to kind of say it's almost kind of their loss if they're not going to see the value that I can bring to the table. But I still, even this off season, I had a new athlete that came in, and we were doing a squat in the weight room, and he had a horrible squat form. And I obviously didn't say in that way, but I basically was like, okay, these are the things we need to address with your squat. And he's like, well, you've never been in a weight room. And I was like,
oh my
okay.
gosh.
And so we get a lot of those that they seem like it's just a one-off, right? I'll do a wide receiver drill or do a cornerback drill, and they're like, how do you know that? And I'm like, well, this is my job. My job is to know how you move, and that you're doing this drill and you're doing that. So I think that for sure was and is still to this day my biggest challenge. I think also I hope it's improving, but I know that there's a lot of thoughts of, you can't have a family, you can't be a woman and do both. And so I think that that's always, unfortunately, kind of what brings a lot of people away from going into sports. Spoke to a girl that was in PT. That was her in PT school. She's actually a football cheerleader and was going through PT school while being an NFL cheerleader. And she was like, my dream is to be in the sports world, kind of what I was doing. And she said, but I had multiple people that are part of this organization that are part of the NFL that was like, oh, well, you can't do that as a girl. And so she was like, I became very discouraged, because she was like, that's why I went to PT. I wanted to do that. And so even still to this day, I mean, this was last fall, these ladies are being told, well, you can't go into that field. And I think that that's why we see so few people make it, because there's enough people that stop them along the way. And I was told at my very first job, there's no reason to get a board certification specialty, where, they didn't encourage it. They weren't supporting it. They didn't want me to get it. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to get that. But if you want to work in the professional world, the requirement is you have your SCS, you have your sports certified specialty. And so all of a sudden when I came to Dallas, they're like, well, yeah, let's do it. Why would you not? This is your drive. This is what you want to do. And so it's truly finding those right cheerleaders around you. And again, I don't find that males have to prove it as much. If you look at side-by-side evals, when I have to do an eval of a new client, I have to sell myself. I have to say, I know this sport. I know, when inherently that male is already perceived to know that sport, already perceived to know what they're talking about.
See, and I don't know anything about football, so I would be horrible.
And you'd be surprised. Like, there's plenty of people, but just by the fact that you're a male, right, it would be assumed, oh, well, you know the demands of my sport, you know my sport, you would be able to treat me better than the female counterpart. And yes, I never played football, but I can tell you a lot about football, and I can tell you a lot about each position and how I'm going to rehab each position. So yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. And so there was so much so I've been a PT now for 15 years. There was so much self-doubt at the beginning. And I almost kind of lost my love for the career, because that's what I wanted to do. And I had so many people say that's really not the route for you. And I think maybe and this is generalized, but maybe in Texas, it's a little bit even more so, right? Because football is so dominant in this state. But then you don't see very many female PTs. And so it just isn't common for a PT to treat an athlete around here.
Yeah. And so how do you do it to set boundaries then, or prioritize self-care? You were talking about getting phone calls at midnight, 1 a.m.
That's one of the hardest parts, but I've learned now to truly, if they want to come see you, and you probably are the same way, like if they want to see you and they value you, then they're going to make it work. Right. And obviously I allow some flexibility, right? I have somebody that does want a 6 a.m. Okay, I can make that work. But if I had somebody that said, I'm only coming at 5 p.m., I would be like, I'm sorry, I have an amazing, person that I can refer you to, but I'm not going to be there from 6 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then for me, I have to work out in the morning. That's kind of my absolute, I will never start sooner than 6 a.m. I actually had 5:30 and 5 a.m. patients in Iowa when I first started, because they work early there, but they're off early, right? But I have, that's important to me, is that I have my workout time. And so even though it may be 3:30 in the morning, it's 3:30 in the morning, but I know that every day I get to work out and have that time to myself. And so I try really hard. I'm not the best working on it as far as sleep, because we know for athletes, sleep is huge, especially if you're recovering from an injury. You truly need 8 hours and 15 minutes of sleep a night. Research supports that, in the sense of to allow your body enough resources to heal from an injury. So when we're not getting that amount of sleep, that sets a lot of people back. And so I try really hard I don't get anywhere close to 8, but I need to be better about that. But I tell these athletes, I'm like, this is your full-time job, so this needs to be a priority. But then the other thing that I do is I tell all my athletes, I do give them my cell phone, but I say at 9:00, it goes to do not disturb. So I turn it is an automatic setting on my phone, and I truly don't budge on that. Now, if they call and they call twice because they push through that, I know that it's probably an emergency, but they know for the most part, I will return their text back in the morning. They don't love when it comes at 3:30 in the morning. So I kind of tell them the same thing, but I think it's important to set your boundaries, because otherwise you'll burn out.
Yeah. I was taught early on that, I give some patients, I actually have a HIPAA secured app that I use for the patients can text, it goes to my phone. But I tell people, because they're like, oh my gosh, why do you have this app? Like, people can just get a hold of you. And I said, well, you'd be surprised how many people don't get a hold of you if you just tell them you're available. Whereas vice versa, if you're not available, people are looking for you all the time. So
that's very true.
So I think that's, people hardly bother me anymore. But I do get the occasional 1, 2 a.m. texts. But
oh my goodness.
Or from the ER, but 8 hours of sleep. I can't go to bed at 8:00 and wake up at 4.
I know, that's the hard part. Us that do early morning workouts, it's very hard, especially the way that our world works, right? Like, there's a lot of things that are set later in the evening, or, we always talk about even sporting events. Like, if you look at March Madness and what time the last games are. Like, if you went to bed after those, right, you would miss half the games. So ideally, that's what they say. 8 hours and 15 minutes is what your body needs to be able to heal from an injury. And so I preach that so much to every athlete, and I encourage them. We do track sleep. They fill out kind of a form every morning to say how much sleep that they got, and then also the quality of sleep. So we do that. And then we also have a nutritionist, a dietitian on our staff that tests hydration. So they also test hydration just with like a tongue test that they do. And so we look at that as well, because I always tell them there's two components that in the grand scheme of things, especially when you're recovering, there's a few components that you get to control. All the rest is time. Your body takes time to heal. So I said, you can control your sleep and you can control your nutrition. So if you take care of those two things, right, that puts you at such an advantage. So we talk a lot about hydration and protein intake.
What do you think about the Nix Sweat biosensor? Have you seen those that you can wear?
I have not.
The patch? Yeah, so it's a little patch. I think it's more popular in the endurance world, but you put the patch on, it has a little module, and it measures electrolytes and
It
sweat
measures your
rate.
sweats.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
so
Actually, I have heard of that. And I have not personally had anybody use it, but have you had
no,
people use it?
I thought about trying it myself, but the thing, as you know, about hydration is it's dependent on so many things. If
Yeah.
if I do a race in Texas and I'm training here, it's going to be totally different. So
Correct.
it's almost a moot point. And in fact, that's why I liked, I did my Ironman in Houston, and, running outside 95-degree weather was nothing. I mean, that was just a training day for us, but now that I'm
Seems
over here,
miserable.
but that's just what we did. So what would be, before we close out, one piece of advice? Well, okay, two questions.
Yeah.
We were talking about overcoming adversity and women in healthcare. What would you tell your 18-year-old self if you got to meet her? What piece of advice would you say? Hey, look forward to this, or watch out for this. What would you say?
I would say to have a stronger belief in herself. I think that was definitely my challenge early on. I think even going through PT school, I was like, gosh, am I really fit to do this career? And there was a lot of self-doubt. And I think confidence was a big challenge for me. And so I would tell my 18-year-old self, first of all, that this is your dream. I always tell people, find something that you truly love. Like, you have to love what you do. We work a lot of hours. And if I didn't like my job, that would not be a fun job to work, 50 hours, 60 hours a week. And so I would tell myself to believe in yourself, because you do truly love this career, and you do truly love the impact that you're going to make on people. And I think that's the most fun. And I'm sure you see it, is when you see, I just saw a patient that I hadn't seen since 2016. And he was like, because of you, I can run now. And, having an impact that many years ago, and to know that they continually thank you for that is pretty cool. And so just truly believing that, okay, you can do this no matter how hard it is, and no matter what adversity you may face.
I think that makes the hard days easier. I get patients that'll come in and, say the same thing, thanks for, getting me back to just life, walking, no pain down my leg, and it makes those days worth it. And people ask me the same thing, why did you want to do this? Or why did you answer my text at 5 a.m.? And I'm like, well, this is, some people are just made for the jobs that they land in. I think that I wouldn't, I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else either. And, as I'm sure that you probably can't either.
Right. I'm the exact same way, for sure.
So gait analysis helps strength. So that's one advice, or they go hand in hand, right? Strengthening, probably checking your gait at some point. I know a lot of wearables now check cadence. So that's probably something that we can pass on to everyday runners. And like I said, when I trained for the Ironman, I used a coaching app, but I didn't go to a coach. So a lot of stuff I looked up on YouTube, or listened to videos, podcasts, things like that. And so that's really what I wanted to hit home was, we talk about elite athletes and, but obviously that's not everybody.
Correct.
What's the final advice for staying injury free and just staying motivated in somebody that's just starting to work out?
Yeah. So I think my first thing is not starting too hard, too fast, too quick in anything that you do. So whether it be, I want to walk for fitness, or I want to run a marathon, or I want to squat X amount of weight, right? I think it's truly starting where you're at, right? And then I also tell people any activity is better than no activity, right? I actually just had somebody reach out yesterday and was like, how do you stay motivated to get up and work out every morning? Because she's like, I've hit a slump and I just can't do it. And I'm like, I tell myself anything is better than nothing, right? And so even if that day is you're supposed to run X amount of miles, but you're like, I can't do that. Like, even if you just walk, That's better than nothing. And so I tell people, don't think you have to do this big thing, and don't think that you do have to put marathon as your goal, right? It could truly be, hey, my goal is to walk a 5K in a year from now. They talk about, that's what actually Jelly Roll did. He took a year to run his first 5K, right? But that was his goal, was a year to do a 5K. And that's okay, right? But he was so intentional because they asked, why did it work this time? Like, why did you starting to be active and making exercise part of your life normal? And he said, because I started with a goal that was not something huge, but I gave myself the time to do it. But then I was intentional about what I did every day. And I think that's the big thing, is that it doesn't mean that you have to run a marathon right out of the gate. That doesn't, and for some people, they may never do that. And that may never be their goal, right? They may start and say, hey, I ran a 5K. I'm happy with that. Now I want to go off and do this. And then the other thing is, I just tell people, making sure to keep your body healthy, to listen to your body, right? And so if you're having pain, I can't tell you how many people were like, well, I had pain at mile 2, but my app said I had to run 8 miles, so I just kept running. And I'm like, no, you can't do that, right? But I think it's also instilled in us, like, if our plan says this, we do this. And so I think it's listening to your body. And if something feels off, are we doing the right things? If you go through your checklist and, like you said, okay, yes, I've been strengthening. I feel like I'm doing the right exercises. Yes, I've been following this app. I feel like I'm doing the right type of training program. Maybe your body just needs a little rest, right? And again, rest doesn't mean to have to do zero activity. And I think that's the biggest thing, is it doesn't mean that you don't do anything for 3 weeks. It may be, hey, I'm going to do upper body and core and give my legs a little rest.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always tell people that it doesn't necessarily mean you have to stop. And I think that that's maybe one of the hardest parts, is if people stop, trying to get back into it is a challenge. And so you want to be able to, again, find something, even if it's body weight, even if you don't have access to weights, right? We know that there's plenty of benefits to doing things body weighted. You don't need fancy equipment. You don't need, that's the beautiful thing about running. Truly, most places you can go out and run without equipment.
I've kind of shifted my patients towards more body weight exercise, even myself. You know, I used to be a huge weightlifter and, would squat 300, 400, 500 pounds. And, now I'm like, that's not good for you. I herniated a disc in college doing the seated leg press and still kept lifting weights after that. Yeah, I did the seated leg press. I remember exactly where I was at. I was in the gym on campus, did the seated leg press, came down and felt a pop, and my legs went completely numb. And, back then we didn't go to the doctor. I walked it off and
went to the next exercise.
Yeah. And so now I'll never get an x-ray of my back because I don't want to know what it looks like. But so yeah, I try to tell people the same thing. Just, body weight, just get out there and move. Yeah. You've got to start somewhere. I was looking on some forums on Reddit, and people were asking about exercise advice and just moving. And, it's little steps. It's parking your car a little bit farther away from the door, or, taking the stairs, rather than the elevator. And absolutely doing little things like that. But also I go a lot by feel, and not to prolong too much, but when I had surgery a few weeks ago, I monitor my glucose. I've been doing a continuous glucose monitoring. Yeah. My watch does heart rate variation. So, I wasn't getting those glucose spikes. A lot of literature says you need to get a certain glucose spike, because your muscles are releasing glycogen. And I started reading more about that. I'm like, man, maybe I'm overtraining. And, that was one of the signs. Sure enough, after I had to take the 3 or 4 days off, everything normalized afterwards. Wow. I was seeing those glucose spikes again. My heart rate variation was coming back in. And so I was like, oh my gosh, maybe I probably won't take another rest day off anyway, but until I have surgery again. But, but it is a thing. And, it is hard for people, especially just really motivated. People that are going to do marathons or ultra marathons are motivated people anyway. And so I think those are probably the hardest people to hold back and say, hey, it's okay to take a rest day.
That's the hardest, especially if you're saying, hey, you need to take a rest day when your program tells you that you need to run X amount. I mean, people are just on their programs,
I do that too. I try not to be, I use it as a guide, but, when I probably maybe run more than I should.
I'm for sure. I'm just as guilty, right? But I think the biggest thing is, as long as we're not doing it in pain, right? And that's the biggest thing, because as soon as you do something in pain, you know that your body is changing its gait, it's changing how you're doing things because you're trying to avoid that pain region. And so I always tell people you're doing way more harm than good by just pushing through. Because I think, again, growing up, we were always taught, like, if your leg isn't cut off, you just keep going, right? Like,
Yeah. Well, before we go, are you training for anything? I know you've done a couple of races. Do you have anything coming up, or?
Yeah, so I'm running San Diego Marathon
Wow.
at the end of May. So I think it's technically June 1st is when the actual race is.
Okay, well, June
So-
7th, I'll be in Malibu. That's where my
Oh, really?
my 50K
Is
is.
that-
So,
Oh, 50K. Is that your next big race?
well, so we both my wife and I signed up for a half marathon in Lexington. If you ever get a chance to come back this way, the Lexington run the bluegrass is beautiful. You get to run through all the
Yeah.
horse farms. So we like doing that one. Flying Pig in Cincinnati is a big race. I don't know if I'll make it. I did
Yes,
sign up.
that
I don't
one
know if I'll
actually
make it.
worked when I was in
Oh, did you?
Cincinnati. I had to work the Flying Pig. Yeah.
So that one's more of a logistics issue with the kids and stuff. But
Yeah.
the 50K, definitely, we're just going to make a trip out of it. So
That will
So I
be
think
so
that'll be
much
good.
fun.
I did miss the Maui marathon. We were in Maui in January, and we were literally leaving Sunday, and the marathon was Sunday. And I was like, oh my gosh, if we would have stayed one more day, I would have run it.
One more day, I would have just gone and run it.
But, well, good luck on your race.
Thank you. You as well.
And thanks for all your insights. I was very excited about this because I think you're a little bit famous, and I don't think you give yourself enough credit for what you do. Sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I'm talking to this physical therapist that works with all these elite athletes.
Well, thank you. I love being on here.